One of my earliest childhood memories is going trick-or-treating around the neighborhood that I grew up in. I didn't have much of a costume because I only decided last minute that I wanted to join my big brother. I've been terrified at the idea of all these miniature monsters walking around outside, but that fear was gradually and eventually outweighed by the promise of a huge haul of Halloween candy. My mom used some leftover monster makeup to paint my face like a skeleton, and then I wore a torn-up trash bag like I was some kind of garbage ghoul. And I must have looked pretty silly compared to some of the other kids in their Batman and Superman costumes, but that didn't really bother me. All I was interested in was getting my fair share of candy, and boy was there lots of that. My brother was 13 at the time, so he agreed to escort 9-year-old me around the neighborhood with him and his friends from middle school. And I couldn't believe that I'd been so frightened by the whole thing because actually being out there, knocking on doors and showing off our costumes, it was some of the most fun I'd ever had in my entire young life. People were giving us a ton of candy. And not just candy either, they were giving us all kinds of things. One house we knocked at, I think it was the town dentist, gave us all toothbrushes and then reveled in our looks of disappointment because they revealed that they were just kidding and gave us some real candy. Another place gave us all these miniature Charlie Brown comic books. But at one point, a man told me to open up my candy bag and then drop something small and white into it before walking off. I didn't realize Halloween was like Christmas, only spookier, and by the time me and my brother arrived back home, I think it had fast become my favorite holiday. The next thing I remember, our mom asked us to empty out our bags of candy at either ends of the kitchen table. Her plan was to take maybe 3/4 of what we'd gotten, then put it somewhere safe so we couldn't eat ourselves into a diabetic coma. But shortly after emptying my bag onto the table, Mom came over to divide up the spoils and took one look through my candy and then immediately started to freak out. She kept pointing at this one particular item and asking me, "Honey, where did you get this? Who gave this to you?" Then when I told her I didn't know, she kept yelling at me to think harder, that I had to remember who put it in my bag. I remember getting upset and starting to cry, and then crying even harder when my mom picked up the phone and told the operator to put her through to the police, because in her words, this was an emergency. Now 30 years before, back when my mom was around my age, all the kids in the town we grew up in went trick-or-treating on Halloween. One little girl went out with her friends, but didn't just come home with a bag full of candy. She returned home with a little white doll stitched out of cloth rags. The girl's mom didn't think anything of it and let her daughter keep the little white doll. But just a few days later, there was an incident in a public park. The girl's mom took her to the park, some place that had like a sand pit and a jungle gym, and while her kids were off playing with the other children, she strikes up a conversation with one of the other moms. The whole time, some guy had been leaning on the fence surrounding the jungle gym. The lady figured that he must have been one of the kids' fathers, maybe even grandfathers, just watching on as his kids or grandkids played with all the others. But then, as the mom's looking on, she sees the guy get her daughter's attention, call her over towards the fence, and then starts talking to her. Again, this all appeared perfectly harmless, but then the mom watches as the guy who's wearing a long coat, hat, and a scarf, just covered up so his face is slightly obscured, reaches out and asks for her hand. The mom watches as her little girl gives the man her hand, and then when the guy leaned forward and appeared to start smelling her little girl's hand, she starts walking over to intervene. She tells her kid to get away from the strange man, then starts asking him what his business is talking to children like that. The guy didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked off before the mom could actually confront him. Naturally, the mom wanted to know what the man had said to her little girl, but when she asked her, the answer she got back raised more questions than they answered. First off, the little girl said she couldn't understand what the man was saying to her, but when her mom asked how she knew to walk over and give the man her hand, all at his direction, she acted very confused and then said she didn't know. The girl also said that when he raised her hand to the man, he hadn't sniffed it, like her mom thought he had. Instead, He'd said something to it, something which again the little girl couldn't understand. The girl's mom then asked if she knew the man from anywhere, like if she'd seen him around town, and the girl replied yes. It was the same man who'd given her the little white doll while she was trick-or-treating. As you can imagine, the mom was terrified, and in discovering the connection between the doll and that creepy man, she rushed to inform the police. The cops put out some APB on the guy, and almost every cop in town was out looking for him, but after no one caught sight of him, they figured that he'd been a drifter that had skipped town at the first sight of trouble. None of the moms from the park recognized the guy, which, in a town our size, usually meant that he was an out-of-towner. So when 48 hours went by, and there had been no sightings of the guy from either civilians or law enforcement, everyone just kind of figured the guy had moved on. It took just days before they realized how wrong they were. One morning, a young mom walked into her daughter's bedroom to wake her up for elementary school, only to find that she wasn't in her bed. She looked around the house a little, then when she realized her daughter was nowhere to be found, she alerted her husband, who in turn called the cops. And within 24 hours, almost every cop in the state was out looking for this missing girl. But while a whole army of cops and volunteers are out searching the fields and woods surrounding town, a team of state police detectives performed a search of the girl's bedroom, I'm guessing to see if they could find any clues. Then guess what they found? Tucked into the missing girl's pillowcase, a little white doll, one that looked like it had been stitched out of old rags. The police then held a press conference asking if anyone else's kid was in possession of one of these little white dolls. Only one set of parents came forward saying their little girl also had returned home from trick-or-treating with a little white doll in her candy bag, and that little girl just so happened to be my mom's best friend. I bet you thought I was going to say that little girl was my mom, didn't you? I can't blame you. And so did I when I first heard that story from her. But even so, she was half traumatized by the whole thing because not only did her friend and her parents almost have a nervous breakdown out of fear, but they also ended up moving out of town because their kid just couldn't feel safe there anymore. Mom said that she and everyone at school was convinced the man would come back in the middle of the night and snatch her up out of bed just like he'd done with that missing girl, who, by the way, was never found. No corpse or remains ever showed up anyplace. There were no credible witness sightings of her anywhere despite all the public appeals, and they didn't even find any articles of clothing or anything like that. It was like that little girl just vanished off the face of the earth, and that only gave credence to the theory, propagated by local kids, that the child snatcher had been some kind of boogeyman who targeted children with little white dolls on Halloween before eating them alive on the nights that followed. Obviously, that's not what happened, but it also wasn't like adults could tell their kids the whole truth. All they could say was that the girl was lost and that everyone hoped she'd come home safe one day. But no one believed that. Not really, anyway. In fact, a quick death would actually have been one of the more merciful options available, given the circumstances of a grown man abducting a little girl from her bed at night. I mean, again, it's unlikely the guy crept inside and snatched the kid kicking and screaming from her bed. The dolls were to win the kid's trust, so when the time came, they'd come quietly, not loudly, and go quietly she did because, as I said, no one found any trace of this girl or her abductor, and she was declared legally dead around the same time I graduated college. The town moved on, but no one forgot, especially the ones close to the whole thing, which explained why my mom got so scared when she emptied my bag of candy onto the table and saw a little white doll stitched out of old rags lying among the chocolate bar and candy wrappers. As you can imagine, she too rushed to call 911, and after the cops got a hold of the little white doll, the whole town basically went into lockdown while they searched for the person that might have placed it in my bag. No kid was allowed to go anywhere alone for days, and when the commotion died down, the cops said it was most likely some kind of copycat just looking to scare people. They figured it was probably some teenager who'd heard the story of the little white dolls, along with that of the girl who went missing just days after they were handed out. They didn't think they were seriously going to complete the copycat process and try to abduct any kids who received dolls. I wasn't the only one. But given the weight of police presence on the streets come November 1st, there was a good chance it was that and that alone which deterred the copycat from going through with it. I didn't hear the whole story until many years later, and while my dad thought the whole thing was dumb and that it was just kids being kids, it had quite a heavy effect on my mom, I guess because it brought back all those bad memories from her childhood. I mostly believe it was a copycat too, as in someone just playing a dumb prank, because no one ever tried to snatch any of his kids who got the dolls, not even years later. But sometimes I wonder how much of a prank it really was. If the whole town didn't take the dolls seriously, or the guy hadn't picked my candy bag to drop one into so that my mom didn't see it, would things have still happened the way they did? Or would have another kid have gone missing in the middle of the night, snatched up by the man who made the little white dolls?
Halloween has unfortunately never been a big deal out here in Scotland, and that's always bummed me out because I love Halloween. But after this year, I think I'll be happy never celebrating it again. My street and the next street over have a lot of young kids who go out trick-or-treating, so while I was out shopping all day with my mom, we decided to pick up some sweets in case anyone came to the door. I had plans to go to the cinema to see the new Ouija movie with my friend. So when I got home, I was getting myself ready to go out, and my mom was busy putting the shopping away. So when the first load of kids came to the door, I was the one who had to answer it. There were children from our street, the next one over, and the next one. Some I couldn't recognize, as well as an adult at the end of the path, who I guessed was either a father or an older brother. They were dressed in all black and had some sort of mask covering their face, but it wasn't anything I recognized from a movie or anything. Anyway, they had all told me their jokes and I gave them their treats as they made their way back down the path and onto the next house. I was about to close the door when I noticed that guy with the kids was still standing at the end of my path. I backed away slowly into the house as I watched him raise his hand and wave very slowly at me. I was about to call out to him when my mom came to the door to make sure I was alright, and he then took off in the opposite direction. He hadn't been with the children at all, and he left as soon as he realized that I wasn't home alone. I was completely freaked out by this and told my friend all about it when he came to the house to pick me up, but I quickly forgot all about it when we were watching the movie. When I finally got home, it was getting really late and trick-or-treating was well over at this point. I got inside and my mom was just getting ready to take the dogs out for a walk so that they could go do their last-minute business and that they would meet my dad on his way home from work, so I was going to be home alone. Anyway, so I was then home alone and grabbed some snacks and went up to my bedroom and onto my computer so that I could finish up some of my writing. After my first creepy encounter with the guys coming into my house and into my backyard, my dad then brought a motion sensor light and attached it to the wall of our house right outside my window. Normally, it will go off whenever a cat walks along our fence, but it will usually go off after a couple of minutes. I always know when the light has to come on because it lights up my whole room given where it's placed, and while I'm sitting at my computer, the light then came on. I felt my blood run cold when I looked out and saw the creep from hours before sitting on the fence, waving at my window to keep the light on. Luckily, I heard the front door open and my parents coming into the house with the dogs, so I rushed down the stairs and started screaming at them about the guy on the fence. My dad didn't question me. He just took the dogs and rushed through the house, threw the back door open and ran outside, and then I heard him shouting, "Get the hell out of here, you creep. I'm going to phone the police." My dad scared him off, but I convinced him not to call the police because I didn't want to make the whole situation worse. I just wanted to go to sleep and forget all about the whole night. Thankfully, I haven't seen the man since. This happened to me when I was 24 years old while home alone, primarily on Halloween night. During this time, I was still living with my parents as I was still a college student that didn't have a job with any money. My parents had to take my younger brother, who was around 10 at the time, to one of his friends' Halloween parties to have their fun. I had been invited to a Halloween party myself, but decided not to go as I'd came down with a mild fever earlier that day and didn't want to risk it going back up. Therefore, I was left at home to hand out candy for the trick-or-treaters, which I didn't mind even though some kids would be annoying. Throughout the night, I'd constantly be sitting on the couch, either playing some video games or watching Netflix, and would pause it once there was a knock at the door. Fast forward to around 10 p.m., Halloween started to die down. People stopped answering their doors and turning off all the lights until everyone was gone. Just as I was about to turn off the TV and get some shut-eye, I heard yet another knock at the door. In my mind, I thought it would be more of those pesky trick-or-treaters, but when I opened the door, I was greeted as someone who was at least 6'5", definitely not a kid. They had on what looked to be a zombie mask of some type, which I must admit was pretty creepy. The design was on point and the mask seemed very well detailed. I also noticed that he had a handgun sticking out of his back pocket, but at that point I completely dismissed it as a prop. "Oh, hey there, happy Halloween," and proceeded to grab the bowl so he could take some candy. The only problem was that he either didn't acknowledge or care about the fact that he even said anything. In fact, I noticed that he didn't even have a candy bag with him. He just stood there motionless, slowly tilting his head to the side to, I guess, create more suspense. At this point, I'm a bit creeped out and told him that I had to go and to have a nice night, while closing the door and making sure it was locked. I looked through the people, and to my surprise, he was still standing by the stoop like a statue. I figured that it was probably some edgy teen playing a joke on people and that he'd eventually have to leave. And he did. An hour later, my parents had returned home with my brother and I decided to call it a night as I had class early the next morning. But there was yet another knock at the door, this time much more loud. I opened it and was greeted with two police officers with very serious looks. My dad then came to the door and one of them had asked us if we had seen anyone come to our house with a mask and a concealed firearm. At first, I didn't know what they were talking about, but then I remembered about my encounter. Their description matched the person I saw almost perfectly, and it was no doubt him. They went on to explain that the person I saw supposedly murdered his girlfriend and had dumped her body in a nearby lake. He was put in a mental institution a few years back and was released on, quote, good behavior. My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach as they said this. A few days later, my mom found a letter in our mailbox that wasn't in any sort of envelope. Written in big bold letters were the words, "You made the right decision when you locked the door." In 2014, something happened to me on Halloween night that made me not ever want to celebrate it again. Halloween is supposed to be a fun and exciting experience that only happens once a year, and I've heard over the years that some unsettling and creepy things had happened. Kids finding sharp objects in their candy, people receiving candy only to find out they were actually drugs, and so on. Anyway, I was 10 years old and I was trick-or-treating with my two other friends under the supervision by my older brother who was 18. We had been trick-or-treating throughout the night, having a blast and enjoying ourselves. At one point, my candy bag, aka my pillowcase, was nearly filled to the brim with that addictive Halloween candy. By now, Halloween was practically dead, and the neighborhood was basically a ghost town when you looked at it. My other two friends, on the other hand, wanted to go to one last house on the block that had lots of decorations indicating that there was more candy. My brother went with them while I stayed on the other side of the street, when I hear what sounds like an engine. I look to my left to see an old soccer mom car coming down the street with its headlights turned off. The car slowly crept toward me, coming to a complete stop as it pulled up next to me. A man, I'd say in his mid-30s, rolled down the window and said the following. "Hey there, hun. my son and I were trick-or-treating and we lost our dog and can't find him. I'm sorry, but would you be my little helper and help us find him? It would really help me out." In my 10-year-old state, I assumed that he really did lose his dog, so I gladly accepted. Big mistake. As I'm walking toward the car, I noticed something through the passenger side window. Let me point out that it's completely dark out, and if it wasn't for the light from the moon, I wouldn't have seen him. There were 2 men in the car wearing masks looking straight at me through the tinted windows. All of a sudden, I see my brother and my friends come my way, and I let out a sigh of relief. As soon as the men see my 6'6" brother, they immediately floor it down the road, never to be seen again. My brother told our parents about the incident, but I don't know what happened after that. Now that I'm much more older, I became a little more wise as to what actually happened.